For today's dungeon, we are on to Honor of the Waves, far up north at the top of Frostgorge Sound. We've of course already seen it in story, and in that instance, to solo it, we were on Carraflower playing a condition damage build. I've already talked a lot about the merits of condition damage builds on Necromancer for PvP, for Wild vs. Wild, for a lot of the more dynamic, shall we say, content. Playing Condi builds on Necro is extremely strong. However, at launch, conditions really weren't that good. They only stacked up to a very low limit, they weren't affected by modifiers like vulnerability, and in general, because of the speed at which you clear through things in dungeons, it was nearly always better to play power. And I've not really shown power. You can do that on Necro. It was never necessarily favoured, but I wanted to show that off here for this dungeon. So we're actually in a set of Berserker Gear now. Back to some Sylvari cultural, dyed a little bit white for the snowy environments I quite like. And you'll notice that our weapons are, first I have a staff, just for the sheer utility of it, applying weakness and breaking break bars with chill and fear. But over here, we're back to Dagger War-Horn. They're both very necromancery looking weapons. In fact, this staff is a beautiful necromancery looking staff from Vanilla as well. And so we're going to be mostly killing people with the dagger, who has a very fast auto attack that can stack really high numbers. You'll see that the third chain here, Necrotic Bite, in the dungeon as we go forward, can hit all on its own up to 10k and above. And you rapidly roll through this. So this is a Berserker build, picking up Soul Reaping, Spite, and Blood Magic. And the way basically we run this is holding the War-Horn 5, doing a lot of dagger auto attacks, dropping wells for extra damage, and every now and then dipping into Shroud to increase our damage more, apply Fear, which increases our damage even more, maybe a Tainted Shackles for a bit of damage, and then swapping back out to keep Soul Barbs rolling. Soul Barbs is a newly implemented trait that wasn't in the original series, so just to show off, entering or exiting Shroud increases your damage by 10% for the next 10 seconds. So I go into Shroud and I get a 10% buff for 10 seconds. I leave Shroud and it goes for another 10 seconds. So we're basically going to flip in and out of Shroud, but mostly rely on using daggers to attack. It's a very simple play style, but it actually does a pretty good amount of damage. And so hopefully you guys enjoy that. There's some other little nuances in there, but I wanted to open the video showing off just the idea of the build first of all. The Flesh Golem is for break bar. We get the Whale of Doom for break bars. In fact, this build in general has a lot of CC on demand, and that'll be very useful for a lot of the big dangerous bosses we're about to fight as we go up north. So I'll see you guys over there. Oh, I do tell a lie. Of course, we're actually going to be starting at Lion's Arch, showing off the flavor text about the dungeon. With the party gathered, we are once again playing with 4 damagey builds, such as mine, and also one of us is playing support. That's an engineer support, and we'll be talking about more a bit later. I think you'll probably be able to tell from the timestamp of this video that Honor of the Waves has a lot less going on with it than many of the other dungeons. I think it's probably, in terms of raw amount of things to look at and see and interact with, the most thin on the ground dungeon in the game, and probably the victim most of all of them of time crunch. So, the description here is that Honor of the Waves is a Coden sanctuary, a massive floating city on an iceberg. They say it's slowly sinking into Frostgorge Sound. ... But don't be too disappointed in what I just expressed about this dungeon. It is still very gorgeous, and the places that Explorable allows you to visit that we never got to see in story are really quite special. Remember that Norn at Holbrack talking about sanctuaries the size of Holbrack itself? Well, the Explorable version of this dungeon really pays off on that in one of the paths.
Search the waters for castaways. Some are likely injured and will need help getting back to shore.
Outside the entrance, we do have this Wayfarer of the Waves, no meta to deal with to gain access. They say, be careful, the Honor of the Waves has lost its voice, and our claw is within, fighting the servants of Jormag. And we say, what is Honor of the Waves? He says, the Honor of the Waves is our sanctuary ship. We of the Coden race sailed here, fleeing Jormag, but one of his lieutenants damaged the ship beyond repair. We can say, what are the claw and voice? To which they say, the claw is the military leader, while the voice speaks to our god. The voice died soon after we were struck, and the claw is still fighting Jormag's minions. So yes, we did see the voice die, in fact become corrupted during story mode, and we get to see the fallout of that here. We can ask what needs to be done, and be told to go in with 5 adventurers. In fact, this has a really kind of epic revenge quest, Kill Bill style feeling to it as a dungeon, as we avenge the lost voice. The Sons of Svanir have invaded the damaged Coden Sanctuary ship in order to earn Jormag's favour. Again, we're going to be fighting the same general enemies we saw in story, that being the Sons of Svanir and the Ice Brood. So you can see here as we have a quick look around, we're starting in the exact same chamber we were before, the doors are closed just as they were before, and even the NPC we approach at the start is the same. We're going to be hanging out again with the Claw, who went on a significant adventure with us in story and will continue into Explorable. You come here at dangerous time. Jormag's animals roam freely on this sanctuary, threatening all of us. We can say what happened. He says, we endured a terrible tragedy here. Our sanctuary has crashed and is sinking. My kin are trying to keep our home afloat, but 3 of Jormag's dogs are plaguing us. Once again, in a similar dungeon to Ascalon Catacombs, in that the 3 paths are defined by the defeat of 3 big creatures. Dogs? Wait, I think I need to know more. 3 sons of Svanir, each cruel and destructive, each seeking favor with their dark idol. One is a butcher, another zealot, and the last is a vandal and a plunderer. So, 3 Sons of Svanir members. Path 1 is to do with the butcher, called Ginva. He kills with abandon, thinking each kill will bring him closer to Jormag's favor. He's a madman who speaks with weapons and will not rest until we are corpses at his feet. Pretty grim. How do we defeat him? He's arrogant enough to think he can march on us without resistance. We will strike at this arrogance and cut his heart out before his forces come this way. Remember, we are hanging out with Coden, ferocious bear people. Jesus. So yes, path 1 will be the butcher. We'll get the information in these other dialogue boxes as we do the other paths. Weirdly, the way they structured the dialogue in this dungeon is a bit different to the others in how it transitions to voting. We get the information, then the cutscene, then the vote.
We thought the huntsman's death would bring balance to our home, but it is not so. Instead, 3 of his prized animals have been unchained and roam free on the sanctuary. There is a zealot for Jormag who believes every kill is a prize that brings him closer to his evil master. Somewhere lurks a plunderer who will erase all of our culture and history if he is not stopped. And last is a fiend who readies an army to march through our home, bathing us all in blood. Consider these threats, then say which one you will help me vanquish.
Once again, I think it would have been really nice if in story, when we defeated the huntsman and we saw that last cutscene, maybe there was a sign that these other members of the Sons of Svanir were being released, but we just didn't get it. So here's the voting. Tell me, which dog of Jormag will we hunt? Well, the butcher. He must be stopped before he launches his attack.
The scent of blood is unmistakable. The frozen-handed butcher is this way. He must be stopped, or we will all drown in our own blood.
I'm really noticing a trend with the dialogue in dungeons. They're pretty intense and gruesome with how they describe things. I wonder if the developers had a specific idea of keeping open world dialogue light-hearted, even if it's in a place like Or, keeping it semi-light-hearted in the personal story, but then giving the really grim Guild Wars 1 feely stuff here in the dungeons. And because people skipped the explorable dungeons and it was deliberately de-emphasized, that meant that the game just felt like it was missing it in general, when in fact it wasn't. They were just reserving it for this feature in this area here. So, we do start off very similar in Path 1 to how story opens. The same door opens, and you can line of sight the initial enemies in almost the same way. Of course, last time we were here, the Claw of Jormag was flying over and we were dealing with an ice thing, but this time it's just some Sons of Svanir. I do want to show you some consumables in my inventory here. We're going to be drinking a potion of Ice Brood Slaying, which should bump our damage. We're also going to have this food here, a bowl of seaweed salad. So this gives us swiftness when we kill things, but also 5% damage while moving. The reason I'm eating this food, and I'm going to use through this dungeon, is because for many years, this was the most meta food in all of Guild Wars 2. It used to be a 10% damage buff. That's as strong as many of our traits, and the only thing you had to do to activate it once you've eaten it was just to strafe left and right constantly while fighting. People who chose the chefing discipline would craft seaweed salad, and if you knew where to get the constituent parts for it, like the seaweed and whatnot, you could actually make a pretty penny from it. Because this food was the best food, it actually affected what other players were doing out in the world to make money. And while it lasted, I always loved that phenomenon and wish Guild Wars 2 had more examples of it happening. The game was in this state, with seaweed salad being the meta thing, for years and years, to the point that many of us still have muscle memory of constantly strafing and constantly moving, even when we don't have to. I actually think, in a way, it ruined a lot of footage people gathered of Guild Wars 2 combat and dungeons for X amount of time, just because we were all constantly, pointlessly vibrating in place in some vague attempts, it seemed, from the devs to make the game's combat look super dynamic and movement oriented, when really it didn't need to be. Eventually, seaweed salad was nerfed down to this 5% level, and is much more on par with the other foods in the game, and people don't really run it anymore. But since we're going through the dungeons, I just had to show it off. You'll notice that even though I've eaten the food for these opening encounters, as once again we traverse through the exact same story areas, I've actually not been strafing left and right, because despite having clicked it, I kind of forgot that I needed to do that part. I think by the time we get to part 2 or 3, I will have remembered that fact, and you'll see me triggering the extra damage a bit more. But even without the seaweed salad, you'll notice my dagger attack chains, if I get a lucky crit, are going very high on the 3rd auto. All I need to do to chain all of my damage modifiers is make sure I've gone into Shroud fairly recently. I could do it immediately as soon as it comes off of cooldown, but instead of that, I'm trying to be a little bit more precise and only go into Shroud when I anticipate the skill 3, Doom, the fear ability, is off cooldown. That way, every time I dip in, I can fear, leave, and attack them while they're feared, and get extra damage from another one of my traits. So here, you'll notice that the mobs have changed a little bit for this story area. The door on our right, which is where story took us, into the Voices Chamber, is now closed. And instead, we're being asked to walk past a new boss that's down the hole on our left, a troll. So many players would really struggle against this troll and instead climb up here, killing these wolves, and then using the high ground to shoot down at the troll and try and kill it from relative safety. These days, the game's a bit easier, so our team's going to try and fight it on its own terms, but it's extremely dangerous. If you remember on episode 1 of the dungeon series, when we were in Ascon Catacombs, I talked about a potential troll that can burst out of the walls, and over 4 runs of the dungeon, I never got lucky enough to show you footage of it. Well, that troll, that exact enemy with the same combat abilities, appears here, in this dungeon, at a higher level, but then so are we also a higher level, and we can show off its animations and how it works now. So what we're fighting here is exactly the same thing as in Ascon Catacombs, except this guy isn't random. He's a boss you have to fight, and he's a real challenge. So first, he does this leap. Right now, he's only leaping in place and landing down, so it's pretty easy to avoid. But when he lands, not only does he knock down and do a ton of damage around him, he sends these shockwave projectiles flying at us that, as you can see, really ripped through my team. The only reason I survived this is because I'm a necromancer with high vitality. Avoiding those leaps he'll periodically do is one thing. It's a good idea to keep his break bar down as much as possible. But his auto attacks are bouncing projectiles that daze and do good damage too. So he has a lot of ways to rip through your defensives in terms of stability and whatnot. There's another leap which we have to carefully avoid. And I believe one of his other abilities involves fearing us. As you can see there, I've been knocked away. So an extremely CC loaded boss. And I think he's over-tuned, frankly. Probably because he is originally designed to just be an optional boss in Ascon Catacombs. This is just another sign to me that this dungeon was probably under time crunch, and the devs had to resort to copy-pasting a boss from an earlier dungeon in here just to fill up some space on this path. But with the troll dead, we can move into the next room with a bit of dialogue.
I see you with bloody weapons, but I don't feel your rage. I don't see you hungry for more battle.
I have killed 10 Conan, and I'm not even tired.
Weakling! A dozen screamed as I pulled out their hearts. I could kill a dozen more.
That's nothing. I killed fathers and mothers. No, I hunt their children.
Ha! Yes, that's the spirit. Now be ready, you dogs. We'll march through this boat and kill them all.
These Sons of Svarnet are so cartoonishly, ridiculously stupid, I find them really hard to buy. But hey, it's a whole room of very weak enemies you can kill in any way you like. In the olden days, we used to stack next to this banister and post to pull them all in, but this is very similar to that big room in Cordicus's Manor. It looks a lot more intimidating than it actually is. Once you've wiped them out, Several more will spawn in these icy patches that keep pulsing in the area you generally don't want to stand on, but with them cleared out for the second wave, it's now just us versus this boss, Aldous Stormbringer. Aldous' main mechanic is that he has a defensive magic. It looks like protection on his buff bar. You'll see it come up every now and then. But instead of stacking duration, it stacks intensity. And you need to rip the protection off of him by throwing lots of fast attacks his way. While he has that on him, he reflects projectiles, blocks melee attacks as though it were Aegis, and can be generally quite formidable. You'll see as I moused over in there, it's called the Shield of Jormag. For as long as our team stays close and healthy because of our support and high damage, he's not going to be able to get the upper hand on us, and we should be able to melt through him. But I will note, as I more regularly am now with these later dungeons, this is an example of a boss that could be a bit of a problem if you didn't know what you were going up against in the very earliest of days. The room we're in right now is actually really big, and I used to spend a lot of the time at the top of this staircase on some balconies overlooking the fighting room, casting my elementalist staff skills from as far away as possible and furiously strafing left and right so he wouldn't hit me with his ice magic.
Let his blood be the first step in cleansing the sanctuary. There, we journey on through this opening. Beyond here, the Coda Killer awaits.
The way forward is actually in a hole in the floor now, but I did want to walk up the stairs and just show you guys the areas I was just mentioning. It's big, isn't it? There's a lot of detail here. Sadly, now that we can just kill the boss on the staircase itself in mere moments, most players won't look up there. But yeah, look at this! There's a full-on hole in the ground that wasn't here before we fall into to progress on the path. That's not the only time Honor of the Waves will do this. It was quite creative about the doorways and mechanisms to lock you into certain areas until you've beaten the bosses, and I think the other dungeons could have learned a lesson or two from this one. We fall into this Icy Chamber you may remember when I soloed Story I found myself in. This time it's full of ice-brewed wolves that do a lot of damage. You'll see every time I don't dodge these wolves, and in fact our team is really struggling here, and I eat a ton of damage, as a necromancer, I'll often survive thanks to my higher health, and then I can hide in Death Shroud, which gives me my second health bar. It's kind of a basic principle of Necro that they can do something like this, and that innate tankiness is genuinely really useful. It means my gameplay can be pretty brain dead here. Even better, as blood magic specialized, while I'm in Shroud, I'm actually able to regenerate my proper health bar underneath by sucking life from the things I'm fighting. These are all bonus events, by the way, and in fact, when you walk near one of these extra totems, it's described as a bonus event by the game's UI. I really think this was ArenaNet's idea for dungeons in general, that they'd be filled with bonus events. But in the end, there's only a couple. Some destroyers in SE, some ghosts behind a torch in Ascalon Catacombs, 2 oozes in Citadel of Flame, and now lots of copy-pasted totems that you can grab in this dungeon. Again, because Karma wasn't really that interesting to people in dungeons and was easier farmed out in the open world, they were mostly ignored despite ArenaNet's very small efforts. The paths became quite linear experiences ultimately. This next corridor is brilliant. You might remember me talking about it in story mode. First, there's some ice bombs nearby. These are simple, destructible things that explode when you take them out. The devs never really populated any combat areas with them nearby, but there's one here. So as we walk up this corridor, if we're caught in any red ring, we'll get launched all the way back the tunnel, as you just saw there, and we'll have to try again. In the early days, if you walked in a reverse direction into these red rings, you would instead be launched to the other side of the chamber, and it was something I'm pretty sure the devs didn't want, and at some point in the years between, they managed to nerf it so that no matter which direction your character's facing, you'll be thrown back to the start. So the challenge? To get all the way through. That method of turning around, facing the other way, and being deliberately hit by the red rings is a technique I fondly remember using in another game completely. The music you hear at the end of my videos from Little Big Adventure 2 had multiple places you could use this technique. It was great to see it alive and well in a game like Guild Wars decades later. So, once we get to the end, we do have this Sons of Svanir to kill. He's guarding the chain that cannot be pulled until you defeat him. So, unlike with Cornicus's Manor or Ascalon Catacombs, where a single player can make it on their own, then just pull the switch, This time, there is theoretically a challenging boss you'd have to fight, meaning multiple players need to get to the end, and you can't just skip for most others, but he goes down pretty quick nonetheless. A simple line of sight on the left, or temporal curtain if you have it, means getting through these guys, and the final room's open.
What is this? What have they done to you, my sons? My own flesh!
I love how much emotion is in the Claw's voice there as he sees Ice-Brood Coden now flanking this door, but it does seem a little sudden. We just don't get to talk to him enough in this dungeon. Whenever we press F, his dialogue's the same.
My sons, what has become of you? You are consumed by sickness.
Also, shouldn't he be more than familiar with this happening, having fled from Jormag in the north and seen it happen to other significant characters already in story? I don't know. But I like this idea that he's on a quest for vengeance and gets particularly pissed off.
Jinva, you have turned my den into an atrocity. Your rampage ends here.
And how was killing your own children? Come, and tell me of the slaughter. They died for me as loyal servants to Dragon. Their faith was weak, easily broken with a violent hand.
If you want to know violence, I will teach you.
Do not poke the bear, Jinva. So, this is the final boss. The Butcher could be a challenge if you didn't watch his mechanics. You'll see he has permanent protection, regeneration, and retaliation. They are perpetually refreshing, so even as a necromancer, should I rip or steal these, they'll just get reapplied. The game is to get rid of them for good. How do we do that? Well, by breaking the 3 Ice-Brood totem structures in the room. You'll see one's called a protection totem, one's called a regeneration totem, and one is called a retaliation totem. Once they're destroyed, the boons will disappear from the main boss. I love how much emphasis the mechanics of this fight revolve purely around the boon system, particularly considering how spammy and offhanded people can feel about them these days. So our technique is to engage the boss by splitting the party up to each different totem and moving in at once to break them. As the fight goes along, they will respawn, so it's a good idea to keep Jinva next to at least one totem so that when that one respawns, it will be quickly cleaved out by your AoE damage as you hit the main boss himself. And that's what we're doing here, having pulled him next to the retaliation totem. Retaliation, I think, is the highest priority to get rid of, because when you are struck by his retaliation, you can get hit really quite hard. Especially without a support, it can lead to your team dying. Protection is obviously great to get rid of, because it makes him 33% tankier. It's like giving him thousands of extra health. And regeneration too is good to get rid of. It also makes him a lot tankier as he pressure cooker regenerates and negates some of the damage you've done. But definitely the most threatening is retaliation, and putting him next to that totem is the main advice I would offer. As for his actual skills, he does a lot of rangery things. The most deadly is whirling defenses. This skill here you saw I just was forced to dodge away from and resustain my health with a heal. If you face tank that, you'll actually go downstate, and you'll see that's what's happening to some members of my team here. Just watch very closely behind all the crazy animations, and you'll see when he's spinning in place and moving the axes all over in kind of a swirly pattern, you should probably stand away. There, this animation here, you get chunked, you dodge back. I could use my dagger too, to be honest, to hit him really hard there and regenerate. As I'm forced to stand away, and then I move in. I like bosses that force us to go range for a moment, then melee again afterwards. And with that, Jinva is dead.
My kin, my children, the air of violence hangs over them. It will take time to restore what has been lost. We shall recover. We will restore balance. Their legacy will be assured its proper place. But a shadow still hangs over us. It looms from the north, threatening to cover us all. We shall mourn. We shall remember. But we must walk with vigilance. Be well and be ready, travelers.
And that's Path 1 completed. Path 1 is the main path I used to do frequently for this dungeon. In this path, I'd skip doing the other two because the bosses were particularly tanky. I always have a very specific and clear memory of this room as well, having just killed the Butcher, getting one of my earliest exotics. It was a rifle called the Charzooka, that to this day is still one of the largest rifle skins in the entire game. So I can never kill the Butcher without thinking, ooh, am I going to get a Charzooka? Let's load in for Path 2 now and see what that one's all about. Path 2 is all about the Plunderer. So, we can say, tell me about these animals. Why are they called dogs, by the way? I'm not sure. He says Wallum, a shadow that swallows our culture. He is stealing our relics, our history. What he can't take, he breaks, or he sends his minions to destroy. And we know the Coden have great relics. Look at Romka's horn. Why? To take our history to Jormag. For what foul purpose, I don't know. We must stop him, or our footsteps on the world will be erased. I wonder if this does actually reference somewhat the early Norn story we looked at. Your history will remain intact. We will fight Wallum together. Interestingly, in terms of the order of dialogue options here, Wallum is number 3, but it's actually Path 2.
We thought the huntsman's death would bring balance to our home.
So we say the Plunderer, your culture will not be erased so casually. We get to proceed with the path now. Honor's Claw's dialogue does change a bit for this one. He says, come, there are fewer things worth protecting more than history. This vandal must not win. And that's a sentiment I think I can agree with, looking at how spotty our information about the prior Elder Dragon Rising now is, because history wasn't protected well enough. And at last, we can leave from this other doorway. We visit the new Court of Measures.
There's nothing else here worth taking. Break everything you see. This trash is unworthy of Jormag.
The dialogue in the entrance of this room honestly is really easy to miss because the devs throw a ton of monsters right in your main path while the next mini-boss is speaking quite far away. So I'll have to edit in a little thing so you guys can see there. But here he is. He's called Torn Fur, and as you can see, it's another Ice Brood Coden right at the start of the path. I really like the look of his face in the icon next to his health bar up there. You can subtly see his polar bear-y kind of shape there with the icy spike in front coming out of what I guess is his shoulder. In any case, unlike the opening boss of Path 1, the Troll, this guy is not threatening whatsoever. He uses no special mechanics and simply very slowly swings his greatsword. Look at how infrequently his animations trigger here. Seriously, it's probably one every 5 or 6 seconds, and they do almost no damage. I think he's actually using similar animations to what most Jotun do, and when you pick up a Jotun greatsword in some open world maps, you can use the same kind of greatsword skills, but they're no match to contemporary balance. All the other mobs in the area certainly look intimidating too, but a lot won't aggro you during the fight, and yeah, they're not even elites, so you can just kill them in a couple of attacks. This room looks nice, but you'll be quickly moving on to the front of the ship at Sanctuary Prow. Now this is a place that I really like. I mentioned at the start of the video the sense of this sanctuary being the size of Holbrack. Well, when we see it in Frostgorge Sounds, it definitely doesn't give you that impression. It's a fairly small iceberg that you can swim around in just a matter of moments. You can swim under in just a matter of moments, and that's about it. But once we actually get into the dungeon, we're kind of taken into another separate artistic interpretation of what it looks like, because technically in engine we're nowhere near Frostgorge Sound anymore, and the devs can expand it a hell of a lot. Think of the way this dungeon works, and all dungeons truthfully, but it's most evident on this one, as being a bit like the Doctor's TARDIS. It's much bigger once you're inside than it is outside, and I like to think that it's inside that we get to see its true scale. And never anywhere else is that more on display than here with this boss out on the front piers. He himself doesn't do much, as you can see. He has these long charging skills that drop ice fields behind us. With an engineer supporting us, that's actually been getting flipped into alacrity for the team, and thus speeding up all of our cooldown recharge rates. Really fun, and I've very much enjoyed having a support Engie with us on this. But I did want to take a second, while the path wants us to actually walk to the next pier now, to instead run all the way along over here and show you guys what I mean. You'll see now that the mountains of Frostgorge Sound are way off in the distance, big looming things that we couldn't possibly get to, and the oceans around this sinking sanctuary are vast, with presumably incredible depths. Now the tragedy of its sinking, with how isolated it is out on the waters, is a little bit more on display. It's wonderfully striking, and while you might say it's immersion breaking, that the sanctuary we see while in the open world does not line up at all with the real one we get on the inside, I think it's beautiful that Guild Wars can take moments with its engine to really show the same place with a different lens. If they couldn't have done this inside, we might never have gotten anything close to the lore described to us by that Norn in Holbrack. I'm doubtful that the devs went on a big specific discussion and idea with this. It's more just a happy coincidence of how the dungeons are implemented, but they definitely did make the decision to allow us to go outside and see how different things are. They could have quite as easily been cagey about this, like we see in Ascalon Catacombs or COF, and not given us a glimpse of the outer world, leaving the entirety of the dungeon paths inside with walls all around us. I respect what they've given us here, and it's a facet of the game also very well delivered by the next endgame feature set to replace dungeons, known as fractals, but more on those later. This next boss, you'll notice, is extremely similar to the previous one, except now he's fearing. The fears, if you're not quick to cleanse, can move you really far away from him and make this fight take even longer than the previous one. These two Icebrood Norn are extremely tanky, and in the early days, it was having to do both of these back to back that put me off ever really running this path. It was just too much of a slog to spend like 20 minutes out killing these few guys. Here you'll see I got feared off of the edge and was scared that I'd fall into a place that I'd have no way of getting back up from without having to waypoint, but the devs did actually add a staircase for people in this weird situation such as myself right here. I was kind of tipped off that that staircase existed because just as I got feared off, if you rewind the video, you'll see the boss was actually trying to reach me and he started pathing around that way. So yeah, with those two bosses done, this door opens and we can finally go back inside to, well, some underwater gameplay. First, just a glimpse of it, and then later we'll actually have things to fight. Underwater does factor into this dungeon a bit more than most, and I will be very clear, underwater content is extremely janky in 2019, and for that reason, it does represent a threat. I'm changing a couple of my utility skills here, but I do reason that maybe minions would be the best idea, since maybe enemies will attack them instead of us should we run into any real difficulties. But don't worry just yet, next we have another above ground battle with this Norn and two Quaggan.
Keep it moving, while I watch this floating junk pile cleaned out before we sink it.
You won't stop at bringing your corruption here. You want to take our pride, our knowledge, our wisdom.
Your wisdom fails against Jormag's might. We take from you, and you only talk soft words. Your weakness makes me sick. I'd spit in your face, but I won't waste the effort.
It's a cruel totem you worship, all the while laughing and stealing. You walk the path of death, and death has come for you today.
This boss used to spam that line, "Your weakness makes me sick." At least I think it was here. And so I can never hear it in that cutscene without immediately getting flashbacks to that. One of those old audio bugs, now thankfully rectified and improved with the game. So this boss fight will actually struggle on a reasonable amount. I think back in the day we used to try and pull the Quaggan away from the main Norn and fight them separately. But here we'll go through all of them together. These are enraged Quaggan, and actually, therefore, do a lot of damage. We're going to have a fun experience with them once we get through this door. But so, focusing on breaking the break bars first, I'll push in, and we'll see how much damage we can do. The main boss, you'll notice, has got a frost thrower, a lot like one of the story bosses. He also has that weird frost meteor shower too. So I wonder if they just took the story boss, added it to Explorable, and maybe made him a little bit more deadly. Or hoped that the fact he was now a higher level 80, that would inherently mean he's more different and interesting to play. There are obviously the two Quaggan with him. Here, I think the reason we get through this is the entire team was very focused on reviving whenever someone went downstate as soon as possible. And if you do notice that you're the person he's throwing his frost thrower at, it's a good idea to try and get away, because as Caraflower found out in story, that thing is relentless. During this fight, unfortunately, one of us did get defeated, and we're taking this opportunity to show off a mechanic I referenced in the Citadel Flame, but never really qualified. That's of Revive Orbs. So there is sold on the gem store and as random rewards from personal story and Black Lion chests, Revive Orbs. They allow you to get back up without waypointing, even in a dungeon while people are in combat, just by clicking the item. You'll see it takes a few seconds to trigger here. The warrior is being rezzed by the Coden at the same time, but that's irrelevant. And when you get up with a Revive Orb, you're allowed to just fight again. You get this thing under the contemporary version of it, Revive Sickness, that holds you in combat for a few seconds. If you go down again during this period, you'll be defeated very quickly. But aside from that, you can pretty much graveyard rush encounters by using the gem store. It's a mechanic I actually think is truly gross, and one of the closest places Guild Wars ever got to being pay to win. Of course, all this stuff can be acquired with gold, because you can turn gold into gems, but I still don't really like it. And I'm still miffed at how little discussion there was about Revive Orbs and their inclusion in the game for all these years, way back at launch and beyond. Nowadays, in the really hardcore endgame content, raiding, Revive Orbs are, thankfully, disabled. And they always rightly were in PvP, but I didn't like them in dungeons then, and I don't really like them in dungeons now. Back underwater, we could just skip all these creatures, and indeed, that's what most players would be doing at this point. These elite corrupted fish actually act a lot like sharks with their charging, pulsing damage attacks, and they're reasonably tanky. There's nothing stopping you just swimming past and dodging as you go, trying to get to the final chamber where the end of the path awaits. But since for the rest of the videos we've been showing killing everything, we thought we'd do the same. And it did give me an opportunity to show off this amazing looking central chamber here that usually I'm too scared of the fish in the area to really admire. Look guys, this is where the Ice Brood managed to breach the hull. This is where water is rushing into the sanctuary from. What a great idea of a place for them to take us in explorable mode. An awesome detail I've never appreciated until now. I wonder if the idea was that the Claw of Jormag Dragon dived briefly into the frozen depths to do this. After this room, just a few more fish lie in waiting before we get to the Plunderer, Wallum, who is an underwater final boss. It's a good idea to make sure your underwater weapon and aqua breather is of a high level. Caraflower's isn't. Whoops.
Wallum, you will not smash one more relic. You will not take one more piece of Coden culture. Return what you have stolen. Restore this imbalance, or it will be restored for you.
Jormag has no need for your soft words. Balance means nothing compared to his power. I will make him more powerful with your relics, and earn his favor with your head.
You'll notice that the dialogue, nor the animations there, actually suggest those NPCs are underwater. So I wonder if it was quite late in the day the devs decided they wanted this final boss to be an underwater fight, and instead they'd originally imagined it as something on land. Wallum can be dangerous because of my aforementioned comment about underwater combat just being a bit janky. First of all, the size of most animations underwater are kind of crazy, so it's very difficult to look at animations, such as the thing there that just one-shot me. If you look on the bottom left of my screen, the combat log is saying I got hit multiple times very quickly by something called Fan of Mines. And that's the main thing Wallum will do. He throws out mines in a fan shape and they blow up. If you're point blank in his face when he does it, they'll explode and do a lot of damage. If you watch the very start of this fight again, you'll see here the animation is quite clear. Aside from that and his auto attacks, he also has a dart ability, which should move him a fair distance, doing damage as he goes. Again, a bit like a shark, but because players will be crowding around him to do damage, he'll likely stay in the same place and just hurt everyone real bad. That's why you can see two of my teammates are downstate here. There isn't much more to the fight. Break the break bar quickly. Make sure you know your underwater skills. As a necromancer, I really enjoy using the Shroud skill too while underwater, because it's another rolling AoE and a kind of ability that the other Shrouds in the game don't give you. And if you go downstate, just try to swim away while using bandage so that Wallum can't follow you. Remember, this is actually called drowning when you're in downstate underwater, and if you can get to the surface, you'll res even quicker. We are generally locked in a sealed chamber with no place to surface here, and I think that's deliberate from the devs because of the drowning mechanic. It's quite smart of them, but in the northeast corner out, there actually is a small staircase and a pocket of air that isn't used for anything, but maybe you can save your life in. That going there has the advantage of getting away from the boss and close to somewhere where you can resurface at the same time. In the later stages of this fight, you'll see another bug that is a real problem for underwater combat in Guild Wars, and always has been, remaining to this day. Wallum swims towards the ceiling and then somehow clips through the terrain to such a place that we can't actually get at him anymore. I think in truth, he's actually walking around on a surface up there, and my minions have teleported through and are hitting him also. Some of us have skills that can hit him while he's bugged in this way, and luckily as a necromancer I'm one of them, but many members of my team no longer can strike him, meaning this last part is taking ages. He can hit us through the wall, we can't hit him. I guess I'll just count my lucky stars that he's not turned invulnerable at this point and reset his health. It's bizarre and it's frustrating, but it's a part of Guild Wars 2 underwater combat that's pretty difficult to avoid, even outside of dungeons. I'll note as well, Wallum here is kind of doing something that players once upon a time did. If you could find a way to bug yourself out of this room into the ceiling above, you could sneak your way to the end of Path 3 and finish both at once, though that was something the devs never liked, and I think has been nerfed at this point.
He begged for the love of something that does not love, and obtained his treasures through theft and murder. Our culture remains. We shall heal ourselves, just as we shall heal this sanctuary. Yet, there is a coldness here. A long shadow looms from the north, one that could envelop us all. Be watchful and prepare. The battle you wage today will have echoes in the time to come.
You'll notice there's a lot of fluffy dialogue in that cutscene that sounds epic and interesting, but there's no real substance. Our antagonists haven't been fleshed out, our ally hasn't been fleshed out any further than he was back in story. There's no real nuance except just go kill these things. I like the simplicity of that story, but I can't shake the feeling that a lot of this story is little more than placeholder and hastily fleshed out at the last possible hour as the devs realized just how much they had bitten off going for 8 dungeons at launch. With that done, it's time for Path 3 that is so similar to Path 2, I often can't distinguish between the two of them. Really, if you were to show me some footage of a boss or event in either Path 2 or Path 3 on the Waves, I would genuinely struggle to tell you which belonged to which, and that's not true for any other path in any other dungeon, but we'll see what you guys think. Tell me about the Zealot, Sergey. He drives his followers into a frenzy and sends them to us. His is a holy way made of blood and hatred. We will either be converted or die. We say converted? To serve who? To their icy master, Jormag. Yet I heard Sergey revels in gathering minions to his side. If we break Sergey, we end the threat from his cult. Then we strike now and end his movement. On the voting window, when asked which dog to hunt, we say the Zealot. Jormag's madness will not take over this sanctuary. Here you'll notice one of our teammates is AFK. This is what happens when one person doesn't vote and the bar runs out. The majority opinion is automatically selected and we move on. The same is true if we have a split vote. The one with the most votes goes through. And in the event of the tie, say 2, 2 and 1, the path selected will be the one highest on the dialogue list. This time the clause says, "Come, this zealot will speak words of violence and madness until he is silenced. Let us do the honors." And we're going to head back towards the story in Path 1 route now, through this door. It's the exact same content, so I can speed up quite quickly, but this time you'll notice I've got the hang and remembered to actually utilize my seaweed salad. for some hopefully big damage. The one thing I would say about my build is because we don't have a ranger here boosting my precision, and often I'm not enjoying banner effects from my warriors, my precision is actually quite low, and instead of playing Berserker Gear, it might be better to run Assassin's Gear. It's the same as Berserkers, but instead of so much power, you get more precision instead, meaning you'll get to that juicy 100% crit chance all the faster. Every time you see a white number here, aside from my vampirism procs, it's not the best thing in the world. I'd rather that be a crit, and overall, my damage would be way higher. Not that it matters, the dungeon's been pretty smooth so far. Wait until the next underwater sequence, don't worry, that'll change. Returning to where the troll was for Path 1, you'll see he's not here this time, and instead, next to this Ice Dragon totem that was here in Path 1, there's now a champion Ice Brood Goliath. This is a pretty basic enemy to kill. We fought our fair share of Goliaths already. He moves very slow, and you can kite in circles around him to avoid most of his attacks. The main thing is his big jump ability that can knock us back maybe, and also do some damage, but he's largely comparable to the greatsword wielding guy at the start of Path 2. Breaking the Ice Dragon totem isn't really necessary either. You'll see that unlike burrows and the Devourer nest from other dungeons, these ones don't seem to continuously spawn enemies. They just send the occasional little ice shards out that don't interfere with the fight very much. With the door open, and the path so far echoing story very closely, this time you'll see the Norn we fight in this room is a wolf Norn. There are several wolves around him when you walk into the room that then despawn and he goes into wolf form. We don't see this much, honestly. There are some Norn story steps that allow you to fight wolf form Norn, but here we get a legendary one in an endgame dungeon. Could be pretty epic, right? Well, not so much. Again, he's pretty much just using the exact same wolf form as players get, which is cool and all, but means he's going to attack way too slowly and with not enough emphasis to be able to get past our onslaughts. One additional attack he seems to have is this Ghostly Storm skill. It's actually what you'll find the Mistfire Wolf, the unique elite skill players could get with the Deluxe edition of Guild Wars 2, will occasionally cast. I guess that linking there of them both being wolves, unless I'm reading the footage wrong, and instead it's one of my allies that summoned that wolf, and those are allied Ghost Storms. But I think it's him. There's no special dialogue or cutscene for his death. The door simply opens, and we continue following along where we went with story, getting back to the Hall of Balance waypoints and moving underground towards the underwater sections. This hall you'll likely recognize from Story 2. The ice spikes function in the same way. They'll chill you and incapacitate you a bit if you walk near them, so you want to avoid them. The story sequence here of keeping the torches lit was pretty cool, but in Explorable, they don't replace it with anything. Even weirder, you would expect that in Explorable, you'd go out of one of the new side passages, one of these other doors that was closed before, but it is genuinely the exact same route we'll be going through here. Here you can see I'm destroying some ice kegs. Again, they are occasionally littered around the dungeon, but never seem to be where you fight mobs. And it never seems to be that any of the Ice Brood create them in the middle of fights, so you have that fun experience of dynamically wanting to avoid them. Instead, you can just break them at your leisure. Even if you were to go down to those explosions, playing something squishier than a Necromancer, like an Elementalist or a Thief, you would just res up because there's nothing to pressure you while you're in down state. Our next boss here is Fimble. You'll see for some reason he's attacking this Ice Brood Coden, or trying to break the sanctuary itself, it seems, with his hammer. Now that would make sense if we were playing the Vandals path. You know, he'd have extra grunts around that are trying to dismantle the place, gather relics, and wipe the Coden's legacy from the world. But instead, we're on the Zealots path. So why is this guy scripted to randomly attack the walls around? Just to make him look like a thug? I haven't a clue. There's this cool moment here where he goes invulnerable mid-fight, surrounded by an ice shard. I really enjoy that, because the Sons of Svanir runes in the game actually allowed players to do that themselves for years. They were runes that meant when you went below 20% health, you got like 5 seconds of invulnerability and were encased in ice. I think the idea is you're supposed to be able to break that ice, and if players were using the rune in PvP, your opponents would be able to break the ice to be able to counter that invulnerability. It was similar to the ice block mechanic Elementalists get with their ice blow, stunning someone and encasing them in ice until someone breaks you out by breaking the block itself, which had a separate health bar. But Svanir runes and this guy's animation were never fully implemented that way, so it's just a time gate. You wait for the invulnerability to leave and then continue. You'll also notice that Fimble got that at about 50%, not 20. So I wonder if the original version of the runes too was at half health instead of 20. Even the runes themselves now, and many runes like that had unnecessarily long invulnerability and delaying effects, say vampirism runes were another example, have all pretty much been nerfed. So the only sign this was ever a consideration from the devs is this little boss fight here. I actually think lots of Sons of Svanir bosses in this dungeon could have had that mechanic, but he's the only one left, the guy with the hammer. This next corridor is still walking along in story areas. We're basically retreading the path one for one here. This specific section of corridor being where we finally found the voice, and they were corrupted before our eyes. There's no dialogue from the claw to talk about that though, and as we move through it, at last you'll see a different passageway is opened to the central ladders, and we once again go underwater. This underwater leg of the dungeon once again leads to another underwater final boss, but it is more deadly than the previous one. We'll be fighting jellyfish this time, and just as we attempted with the previous path to clear everything out, we decided to start fighting instead of running. But, as you'll notice here, players are dying very quickly. Jellyfish can really hurt when they get a hold of you, and there are a lot of them between us and the boss. Additionally, you'll find corrupted fish and ice-brewed quaggan here, and it's the quaggan that really steal the show. As you'll see, we're all dying and wiping. I'm attempting to escape by getting back to the surface, and I do manage to get into this gangway that I thought was where we came from, but is actually not. This quaggan attacks me, and I manage to kill it, thinking I'm safe, but lo and behold, behind me is another one. He catches me by surprise and puts me in down state. Now, Necromancer is very strong in down state, but as it turns out, not quite strong enough. And the quaggan does just about score the kill, leading to Caraflower's defeat, and we all actually have to waypoint back through. It's kind of interesting to me that while for the rest of the areas of dungeons, things have become extremely easy, it's still probably a good idea to just swim past this area and go straight to the boss. Or you might end up with a fate similar to mine. I'll also point out that what I did there, waiting for ages, trying to save myself in downstate, is actually a pretty disrespectful and bad idea. It would always be annoying in dungeons where players would act this way, with 4 of us waiting to try and waypoint, and the last member refusing to give up, making everyone sit there for up to minutes at a time while they tried to bandage. Often with dungeons, it was quicker to just take the death, let everyone waypoint, and do the fight properly later. But you'd be surprised how stubborn players, like myself, can often be. By the way, on the second trip, look how easy that was to skip.
You have killed the strongest of my flock. You have torn a bloody path to find me. Impressive.
This bloodlust brings me no joy. You have only done what was needed to end your madness.
You fail to see. Jormag has deemed you worthy of death by my hand.
Your frozen demon will consume you, but we will not be murdered for your cause.
Maybe some broken bones and torn skin will change your mind. My time for glory is now.
While this cutscene was going on, I will have been invulnerable getting surrounded by monsters, so as soon as it left and we move into the Sanctuary Gallery here, I knew I needed to use my underwater skills to move fast. This corner is where most people would break aggro after fleeing from the monsters, and it's where I'll now wait for my team before we can engage on the final boss. Sergey is very similar to the Path 2 ending, in that he's an underwater final boss with animations that are easy to miss. He might clip into the walls, and he can occasionally one-shot you if you're not careful. the most defining thing about him is that as we fight, he'll continue to respawn new jellyfishes that enter the battlefield, and I think we can see a barracuda he might have spawned there also. In the past, I have struggled with these jellyfish, but as long as you keep them pulled in and do as much damage as possible around Sergey, you'll find he's a simple kill. For many years with Guild Wars, players have been really good at killing enemies above ground, but underwater is not something most people learn to min-max. I myself have got very weak underwater weapons and aqua breather on right now. So most people didn't enjoy having to do these final bosses that were markedly slower to take out than anything above ground, just because your composition might not be as efficient when you're down here. Your methods of getting might and sustaining quickness and fury and so on wouldn't be quite as easy to access. Some groups definitely do theorycraft and think very carefully about how to play underwater, and that's always been something that excited me. But for general pugs, you could always expect the final boss of P2 and P3 to take a lot longer than any of the others. And that's in a dungeon where, frankly, a lot of these big, beefy, tanky Norn, ice brood or no, take a long time in the first place. With Sergey the Zealot dead, that's the end of Honor of the Waves. And you'll see, there wasn't much dialogue to get through.
See this child, dead, broken, lost 2 times. The first when he followed Jormag. The second, now. His twisted faith left him no room for solace or contemplation. Only hunger, only rage. Too many of his kind have fallen into lies and corruption. So much potential fed into a maw of frozen cruelty, and their master in the north laughs. Listen to my words. Jormag threatens us all, and we must be ready for him.
The dungeon has a couple of references of Jormag laughing, and I really like those. There's obviously a different flavor and style to each of the Elder Dragons, but the thought of one of them being truly malicious, not just a force of nature existing and self-interested, but actually malicious, laughing in the face of those it's oppressing and whose lives it's destroying, seems really fun to me. And I hope if the future holds a Jormag dedicated expansion or big story in the future, as I anticipate it should, the devs remember the way the Honor of the Waves talked about that dragon, because there's some juicy elements in there I'd like to see they take forwards. At the conclusion of the path, back to Lion's Arch, let's see what rewards we can get from the vendors. Overall, I do like Honor of the Waves as an idea for the dungeon, but definitely for story, and definitely for explorable, I think you can tell that this was the dungeon the devs had the least time on, and could have done with a lot more work. I've already explained to you guys that I think the personal story at release probably should have stopped right after Claw Island and the creation of the Pact, with the Orion maps and stories being something the devs could spend more time working on after release. I think the dungeons probably could have experienced the same thing too, with COF being the last one on the initial roster, and Honor of the Waves getting more breathing room to be developed after launch, where there was less time crunch. That said, the next 2 and final dungeons, Crucible of Eternity and Ara, definitely weren't as bad as Honor of the Waves, so maybe it wasn't necessary after all. The Sanctuary runes for this dungeon got a recent update to interact with Barrier that was really quite fun. They combo super well with one of the upcoming expansion's elite specializations, and for that reason are one of the stronger sets. The tonic for this dungeon is the Urton one. No, that doesn't mean you'll become a regular bear, but a Coden. These guys are brilliant, and in Living World they'll revisit this kind of tonic to allow you to not just look like a Coden, but fight as one too. But that'll be a story for another day. Well, there you go, guys. That's Honor of the Waves. Thanks so much to those of you who came along for the adventure. Don't forget, you're all welcome to join Discord in the description and come on future runs. And I'll see you for the Crucible of Eternity next time.